What would you do in my situation? I was a little kid. I used to have the best lunches at school from mum. The best, hands down. It was always very elaborate. I think the best one ever would have been I had toasted Lebanese bread with gourmet dip, and I was 11, 12, and this was a packed school lunch. Now, I was always the envy of my other friends. They would always ask me for some of my lunch. Now, the dilemma is, on one hand, I'm a hungry, growing young boy. On the other hand, there's these friends who are also hungry. But I do not share their hunger. I do not have the same when I eat, they don't get any more full. When they eat, I don't get any more full. So when you look at it on the simplest level, I'm best off having my meal and leaving them aside. Except human behavior is not actually like this. That equation is a little bit too simple because we're missing some second order benefits and effects of sharing. And it never stops baffling us. I heard a story of this the other day from a homeless shelter about people who often have the least are the ones who often share the most. It's very powerful. Now let's come back to that little story and that dilemma for a young Joe. Let's think now about, in the previous episode, we were talking about the war that's been raging for 70,000 years. This war, the breakaway part of humanity that's breaking the rules of natural selection. It hit this new innovation called the cognitive revolution, and it's been using that to win the game of surviving, basically, and go past surviving. Surviving's become easy. Now it's about optimizing the experience. Surviving is a lot easier for most of us than it is compared to the other inhabitants of this planet, the other living things, the animals and the plants and so on. We talked about that last time. Now I should have clarified that for those who aren't aware, natural selection is basically this survival of the fittest, that the good genes that have an advantage to survive, like we had with our thinking and our collaboration and the ability to now start sharing ideas at the stage of the cognitive revolution, gives an advantage. The odds of survival are better, so those genes win out more. A lot of stuff becomes extinct as a result. If you look at human history, we've been responsible for getting rid of a lot of species and other parts of life. And we don't all like that. A lot of us kick back at that. We start to be conscious of and empathize, not just with our own species or group, but the other animals and the other living things. It's quite beautiful, really. So that's the natural selection game has not been accepted of survival of the fittest. We're the fittest, but we're looking at the broader picture because we understand the connectedness of things. That in many ways our survival is actually attached to some of the other living things, and that we're kind of all in this together in this delicate balance. So let's talk a bit more today about Astro the dog and link that to the previous episode. Astro the dog, we talked about in episodes 11 to 13 in particular, is the dog who runs part of your brain. The part of your brain. We've talked to the subconscious, I guess, parts of our brain in many different ways. Technically, we've talked about it as the lizard brain, the elephant and the rider. I love the image of a dog because we have to train a dog, and our relationship with a dog, I believe, better reflects how we should have a relationship with that part of our brain. So when we understand that, in the example and the story we used to kind of unpack this in the previous episode about the stubborn old business partner, you start to see what the role of the dog is. So I just want to link the two instead of having two separate images. So that old business partner we talked about, the stubborn old way of doing things, natural selection, it promotes that very limited view, the zero-sum game. And we talk about Astro the dog. We talk about this part of our brain that is a lot more fearful, is a lot more risk averse, that just barks at the slightest sign of trouble because it doesn't understand things as well. So I wanted to marry these two because understanding that things have changed is possible in one part of our thinking, in this, and it's literally at the front, the neocortex. It's where this high executive thinking happens. It's understandable in this part of our brain, but that change is not as easy to understand in this back part of our brain, the old-fashioned part of the model. So make it clear that the battle is not just happening out in the world. That battle is happening in your brain. Astro the dog versus the conscious part of you. We're complicated, hey? Wow. No wonder why living's so bloody messy. And this is why the animals have a simpler life in many respects. They've got a narrower perspective and self-awareness. We don't. We kind of have this burden of greater self-awareness. So how does that impact us on a daily basis, and how does that influence the way we make decisions? When I was this young boy at primary school, thinking about, do I share lunch or not? On one level, I'm capable of understanding the plight of other people because I understand hunger. I empathize with the group. And I don't want my friends to miss out on the flavoursome, beautiful meal that my mum so often, normally, thankfully, I wasn't a rotten young kid, and I did used to share those gourmet lunches. And what did that do? It made me part of the group, made me accepted, because it's not this narrow perspective, this zero-sum game, this natural selection game. Because if everyone survives and thrives, I also survive and thrive. Being part of the group had other advantages. And sometimes they would be able to share their lunch back with me, and it became reciprocal. But I was accepted, I was helped if I needed something in class. So our species has obviously taken things so much further because of this cognitive revolution. We can understand a bigger story that happens. That there might be a short-term, short-sighted win for Astro and a temptation for Astro, but a longer-term, bigger win for me and others. And it's how far we can extend our sense of, not compassion, what's the word I'm looking for? Our sense of caring beyond ourselves. Do we just extend it to a little group of people, our nuclear family, mum, dad, brother, sister, daughter, son, or can we extend it wider? Can we extend it to our community? Can we extend it to our whole city, our whole country? Can we extend it all the way out to the whole world? Can we extend it all the way out to all living things? That style of thinking is possible. It's not something that all people do. It's not something maybe that most people do, but it's very, very possible. And it's become possible because of the cognitive revolution, but we have this clash. Astro the dog was shaped and still lives in our brains as a reminder of natural selection, which has done most of the work in evolution so far. This cognitive revolution, this innovation, this new startup has only been playing a role for a very short period of time. But it's compounding, and it's going to work at a different rate. So I'm going to rephrase that, sorry. The impacts on the world are compounding. The change in our brain is not necessarily so. That's a very important difference, which we're actually going to be talking about in the next episode. But that's enough for this episode. Something to think about with this super complex and big idea is, how are you going to think? Are you going to understand when you're faced with a decision, a course of action? Are you going to understand, as we talked about in episodes 11 to 13, the difference between Astro the dog in that decision, or what is actually best for a positive sum game? And it's up to you to figure out when and where the short-term versus long-term thinking is appropriate. I think that's enough for one day. In case I forgot to mention it, you're listening to the With Joe Wehbe podcast, the series on how we're wired. And there's the blog post on the widening gap, which we'll talk about next. But these 2 episodes have been on the war that's been raging for 70,000 years. And the website is www.withjoewehbe.com. Until tomorrow, I invite you to just keep having these conversations, thinking about that, and thinking about who else might need this message. Because after all, the best way to open 1,000 doors for you is to concentrate on opening doors for others. Don't forget that, guys. I'll see you tomorrow.